Welcome to the Restricted Handling Daily Intel Brief. Let's dig in. Here's what's been going on in Russia in the last 24 hours. We're stepping into a day where the big picture is getting sharper, but also heavier. Less about isolated battlefield headlines, more about systems under strain, diplomacy that isn't really converging, infrastructure that's getting stretched past its design limits, and internal pressure building inside Russia in ways that are starting to show up in public policy decisions and everyday life. The most important shift right now is happening at the diplomatic level. Moscow is continuing to publicly signal openness to negotiations, but the terms it is laying out remain fundamentally unchanged. The Kremlin is still anchoring any future talks to frameworks that effectively require Ukraine to accept neutrality, accept territorial losses, and accept long-term limits on its military posture. At the same time, Russia is trying to keep a channel open with the U.S. through informal diplomatic intermediaries. There's a clear dual message here. One track is rigid and maximalist for public consumption. The other is more flexible in tone when speaking about future engagement with Washington-linked envoys. But that flexibility does not extend to the core war aims. Those remain fixed. And that tension matters, because it tells us something about Russian strategy. Moscow is not adjusting objectives. It is adjusting how it communicates those objectives depending on audience. To domestic audiences, it's strength and inevitability. To external audiences, especially the U.S., it's controlled openness paired with frustration over stalled diplomatic progress. Now shift into one of the most important operational stories shaping the war right now, Crimea. What we are seeing there is not just a series of strikes or temporary outages. It is a slow transformation of how the peninsula functions as a military and civilian space. Ukraine's campaign is increasingly aimed at the connective systems that keep Crimea viable as a forward logistics and political hub. Rail links, bridges, ferry systems, fuel distribution networks, and power infrastructure are all under sustained pressure. And the cumulative effect is becoming visible in everyday governance. Cities are dealing with rolling power disruptions. Fuel access is being restricted for civilians in some areas. Transport schedules are shrinking. Public services are operating under tighter constraints. Even routine social activity is being adjusted around security and infrastructure limitations. What's important here is the shape of the effect. This is not a single point of failure. It is distributed stress across multiple systems at once that forces Russian authorities into constant triage, deciding what gets power, what gets fuel, what gets repaired first, and what simply has to wait. And that creates a secondary effect that often gets overlooked. It increases friction for the military itself. Every logistics movement into and out of Crimea now has more dependencies, more vulnerable nodes, and more points where delay or disruption can cascade. At the same time, Russia's internal energy situation is starting to reflect similar pressure dynamics. Fuel availability inside Russia is becoming more uneven. Some regions are reporting restrictions, while policymakers are actively discussing stronger export controls and broader measures to stabilize domestic supply. The fact that these conversations are happening at all is notable for a major global exporter of refined fuels. The underlying issue is not just production capacity, it is system resilience under stress. Refining disruptions, infrastructure damage, and logistics bottlenecks are combining into a pattern where supply exists but distribution becomes inconsistent. That creates political sensitivity fast, because fuel is one of the most visible indicators of economic stability for the average population. And that brings us into the domestic political layer. Inside Russia, there are growing signals of strain in manpower generation for the war effort. Recruitment for contract forces is reportedly slowing in multiple regions. The response from authorities has been to increase incentives, expand recruitment channels, and rely more heavily on non-traditional sources of personnel. What stands out is not just the recruitment challenge itself, but how it connects to broader policy discussions. There is increasing quiet debate inside parts of the system about political timing, including whether major electoral cycles might need adjustment under current conditions. That kind of discussion doesn't mean decisions are imminent, but it does reflect how security, Economic pressure and political stability are starting to intersect more directly. And underneath all of this, there is a consistent pattern emerging. The system is still functioning, but it is absorbing more friction at every layer. Now bring in Belarus, because it sits directly in the middle of the operational geography. Belarus is increasingly being used as part of Russia's extended strike architecture. Infrastructure on Belarusian territory is being leveraged to extend the range and effectiveness of drone operations into western Ukraine. That includes systems tied to communication relay and targeting support. This creates a complicated escalation environment. Ukraine views parts of this infrastructure as legitimate military targets because of their role in enabling cross-border strikes. Russia, meanwhile, is framing any potential Ukrainian action against Belarusian territory or assets as escalation against a joint security structure. That framing is important because it expands the perceived stakes of any strike beyond Ukraine and Russia alone. So Belarus is no longer just a rear staging area. It is becoming part of the contested operational space, even if it is not formally a battlefield. Now, on the battlefield itself, the pattern remains consistent with recent weeks, but with important nuance. Across eastern and southern sectors, Russian forces continue applying pressure through small unit movement, infiltration attacks, and localized advances, rather than large, coordinated breakthroughs. This is especially visible in contested urban and semi-urban areas, where control is fragmented rather than clearly defined. One of the key dynamics is that these are not clean advances in the traditional sense. They are incremental gains that rely on persistence, dispersion, and constant probing of defensive lines. In response, Ukrainian forces are maintaining layered defenses while continuing counterattacks in specific sectors where Russian units overextend or fail to consolidate positions. The result is a battlefield that is active everywhere, but decisive nowhere. Movement exists, but it is slow, costly, and highly localized. At the same time, Ukraine continues to rely heavily on long-range strike systems to shape Russian operational depth. These strikes are not just about immediate damage. They are designed to force Russia into constant redistribution of air defense, logistics, and repair capacity. That creates strategic drag across the entire system. There is also a growing intelligence and internal security dimension running in parallel. Both sides are reporting ongoing counterintelligence operations involving alleged infiltration, surveillance, and sabotage planning. While details vary and verification is often limited, the broader reality is that intelligence activity is now fully integrated into the war effort. It is not a side domain. It is part of how the battlefield is being shaped before and after contact. On the information side, there are also sustained efforts to influence perception across Europe and allied political spaces. These campaigns are less about convincing a single narrative and more about increasing noise, friction, and disagreement inside decision-making environments. The objective is delay and distraction rather than persuasion. Finally, there is the alliance and diplomatic environment sitting above all of this. European support structures for Ukraine continue to evolve toward deeper industrial integration, including local production partnerships for defense systems and ammunition supply chains. That shift matters because it reduces dependence on external stockpiles and increases long-term sustainability of support. At the same time, internal European political tensions continue to surface in parallel with the war effort. Historical grievances between partner states periodically reemerge and create diplomatic friction, even while broader strategic alignment remains intact. Thanks for listening and being part of this community. If you're finding value here, a review, comment, or share helps more people stay informed. We also publish a daily intel brief on Substack at restrictedhandling.substack.com, where we go deeper on Russia, China, Iran, the Middle East, and the DPRK. Stay safe and have a great day.